What you're about to hear actually happened while on an internship during the fall of 2014. In order to protect people's privacy, I'm not including the names of my friends, the name of the company I was employed with at the time, or the name of my university. But after you've heard my account, if you feel skeptical or otherwise have any questions about my experience, feel free to email me at 245-33-963-81@qq.com. I know the address looks like a spam email, but QQ is actually an extremely popular social networking site in mainland China, as Facebook, Twitter, and all the Western networks are blocked by the Chinese government. The reason for the suspicious username is that your QQ number is randomly generated and assigned to you when creating an account. That's right. Your identity is literally reduced to an itemized number until you provide personal details on your account. In the fall of 2014, I got a job as a supervisor over 13 volunteer English teachers. I would be working in a Chinese city called Weihai, located in Shandong province. The company that hired me sends English teachers to Mexico, India, China, Russia, and Ukraine each semester. I was super excited at the opportunity because not only would I have the chance to live in China again, but my university was willing to grant me a semester's worth of Chinese language credits as an academic internship. I could get good job experience, live abroad in a country that I consider my second home, and complete a semester of school. It was my dream semester. In Weihai, the volunteers and I lived and worked at a prestigious international private school. They treated us really well. One of the biggest perks being that in addition to the same vacation days as the school's faculty that took place over China's national holidays, we also got an extra week or two of personal vacation time. It was during one of these vacations that I had one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. Two of my friends from the group, I'll call them Sarah and David, decided they wanted to travel down south to China's Guangdong province during the Dragon Boat Festival. I suggested that we visit Yangshuo, a little-known village surrounded on all sides by the region's gorgeous mountains. I'd visited it a year before and wasn't about to pass up an opportunity to visit there again. Search Google Images for Yangshuo's scenery, and you'll understand why I'm so crazy about the place. Yangshuo isn't a large town, but even so, if you plan to do everything that you want while you're there, you need transportation, since most of the things to do are out in the countryside. The problem was that we'd chosen a super busy time of year to visit such a popular tourist location. All the traffic in the area, the entire 6 days we were there, was literally a continuous traffic jam, so taking cabs or hiring rickshaws wasn't an option. We were fine though, as we'd rented some bikes which gave us the freedom to go anywhere we wanted. It actually worked out even better than relying on cabs, because we would be able to get to some of the places that were out of the way or inaccessible by car. I remembered some mud caves pretty deep in the countryside that I'd visited before. It was almost an hour outside of town by bike, so it was more than a little out of the way, but its secluded nature was one of the reasons it was such an appealing destination, especially during such a busy holiday where it was nice to have a break from all the tourists. I convinced Sarah and David to make the trip to these mud caves, explaining how we'd already done everything there is to do immediately around the city. They reluctantly agreed, and the morning of the 5th day, we grabbed our bikes and headed out. We rode for an hour and a half, 2 hours. After the 2-hour mark, I realized that I must have gotten us lost. Granted, it had been quite a while since I'd last been there, so I think it's understandable that I didn't remember the route. Regardless, I felt stupid and guilty because I'd talked up the mud caves so much to my friends and it looked like we weren't even going to make it to them. Not only that, we seemed to be in a completely isolated section of countryside. I spoke the language, so finding our way back to town wasn't going to be a problem, provided we found another person. From what it looked like, we were in the middle of the wilderness. I was worried that I'd inadvertently wasted one of the last days of our vacation. I explained the situation to my friends who groaned and were noticeably annoyed at me, but who, to their credit, didn't complain or even blame me for ruining their vacation. That actually made me feel even worse about my screw-up. This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I knew that losing a vacation day was no small matter to them. We stopped our bikes and began discussing what we should do. Should we continue following the current trail and maybe find someone further along the way? Should we backtrack and run into someone closer to the main road? Should we just abandon our original plan and try to find something else to do in the country? While we were deciding what course of action we should take, I noticed some old-looking buildings hidden within a valley, obscured by the thick vegetation clinging to the steep mountain slopes. I was elated. There were bound to be some people in or around those buildings, and it couldn't have been more than a 15-minute ride from where we currently were. Aside from which, some of the most memorable places in China are the ones that you stumble upon by accident, the ones that aren't known as big touristy places. Our bad luck could turn out to be a good thing after all. It was evident as we rode our bikes into the enclave that it had been abandoned for some time. The buildings were obviously once part of an old commune from the Maoist era when communism was in full swing and everyone was required to live in communal compounds. After Mao's death and Deng Xiaoping started on economic reforms to move China away from communism, people deserted these communes to make a life in the city and chase a capitalistic dream. So what we'd stumbled upon was actually a really cool piece of Chinese history. We decided to check it out, look around, take some pictures, etc. The entire compound was an enormous seheyuan, which is essentially a house contained in the walls surrounding a large courtyard that usually contains smaller structures. Again, you can Google it for a better idea of what it looks like. In this case, though, it wasn't just a single household, it was an entire walled community. The walls themselves comprised the living quarters. The central area contained an overgrown field where they would have kept the publicly owned livestock. It looked like some animals had taken up residence since the people left. Some goats and cows grazed the long grass, and chickens clucked around their feet. Scattered around the perimeter of the fields were a few run-down buildings dotting the compound, which I assume at one point were the dining hall and some small ones for textile mills or some small-time industrial production plants, depending on what this place specialized in. We checked around the living area, and it was immediately clear that this place had been abandoned for several decades. The rooms were almost completely vacant. Only furniture and a few odd assortments of possessions, woks, chopsticks, portraits of Mao, were left behind, creating a sort of gloomy atmosphere amid the cracked and crumbling walls. We snapped some pictures, recorded some videos, and just generally took in the scenery. We were getting ready to leave when I heard a voice coming from the far end of the commune. Was somebody still living here? It was possible. We'd seen some animals left in the central area after all. I'd assumed they were wild, but it made sense that somebody was still raising them. In fact, it probably made more sense because it didn't seem very likely that stray animals would find their way inside a gated community like this. We approached the apartment where the voice was coming from. The front door was slightly ajar and the rich smell of incense wafted out. The voice continued droning on, almost like a chant. David spoke up. "You think this guy knows the way back to Yangshuo? You should ask for directions." I thought maybe the person inside was performing some kind of religious ceremony, so I was reluctant to interrupt him, and I said as much. "We don't know how long they're going to take in there. Do you seriously just want to wait outside their door for a couple hours like a bunch of creepers? Just knock on the door, and if what they're doing is really important, then they'll ask us to wait and give us directions when they're done." I was a little bit annoyed by that, because David had a tendency to use our celebrity status as white people to expect special treatment from the Chinese nationals. I preferred to try to blend in with the culture as much as I could, and I have a strong respect for local customs, particularly religious ones. But he also had a point. Chinese people are naturally hospitable and eager to help others. If this person was a devout Buddhist or Taoist, then their willingness to help us would be even greater, and they would most likely drop whatever they were doing the second they saw us. So I rapped lightly on the door. There was no response. I knocked a bit louder, and the person continued mumbling to themselves. I opened the door slightly and called out to them to alert them of our presence. "Wei? Ni hao." The chanting stopped for a moment, almost imperceptibly, but then continued as though nothing had happened. I pushed the door open all the way and saw an elderly, hunchbacked man wandering around the room, shaking a wooden tool as he hobbled about, mumbling his incantation. He was certainly a communist-era comrade. His hunched posture and wrinkled yet calloused skin told of years of hard work. He was practically doubled over at the waist and only had a few wispy white hairs on the top of his head. His clothes were the classical communist fare: dark gray pants with a matching button-up shirt that reached his Adam's apple, along with a squared-off cap. He must have taken great care of his clothing because they were in surprisingly good shape, considering they were from around the 1950s. It's not like anyone could find a replacement for era-specific clothing 60 years after the fact. Even more surprising than his physical appearance, however, was the state of his apartment. Given how empty the rest of the rooms were in this commune, I was shocked at how decorated this one was. It looked as though he'd scavenged everything his neighbors had left behind when they left. None of the walls were accessible because tables had been pushed up against them, occupying every inch of the room's perimeter. The tabletops were completely covered by candles, statues of miniature Buddhas in various poses, wilted flowers, beaded bracelets, and necklaces. The shoes of infants, calligraphy drawn carefully on rice paper, and what looked like the personal effects of loved ones who had either passed away or abandoned him. There looked to be thousands of other items that I couldn't even begin to identify. I approached him and began to speak, asking if he was familiar with Yangshuo and if he would be able to help us find our way back to the main road. In response, he only muttered a short phrase. "Wo shou sigaran." Wo shou sigaran? I'm short 4 people? Was this person expecting company? "Excuse me?" I asked in Mandarin. "Wo shou sigaran," he repeated again, urgently. He glanced at me, and then his eyes darted to Sarah and David. He looked between the 3 of us, repeating this phrase over and over. I felt bad. This poor man must have been senile. Maybe his friends or family had left the commune and promised to come back, and he was still awaiting their return. Or maybe he was just pretty far gone, and honestly believed he was preparing to receive 4 guests who hadn't yet arrived. I tried communicating with him a few more times, but he simply continued mumbling this cryptic phrase, shaking the wooden object in his hand. I took a closer look and realized I'd seen the object he was holding before. It was a religious instrument used for venerating statues of Buddha. Similar to how Catholics believe that partaking of the Eucharist purifies members of their sins, Buddhists use tools like the one this man was shaking to sprinkle statues of Buddha with water, symbolically cleansing themselves. They were shaped like Spanish maracas and were riddled with tiny holes that would allow for several drops of water to escape each hole with each shake. Sometimes people would infuse the water with lavender or other herbs to invoke a pleasant smell. I don't know what this man had mixed in with the water, but it was a pretty putrid stench. I ignored it and turned back to Sarah and David. "What's he saying?" Sarah asked. "He just keeps saying, 'I'm missing 4 people,' I replied. "What does that mean?" "Honestly, I have no clue, but I have a feeling he's not going to be able to help us. Should we just try to head back to the main road and hopefully we'll run into someone there who can give us directions?" "What the hell?" David yelled. Sarah and I spun to look at him. "That old guy just soaked me," he complained, motioning to a wet spot on his shirt. I rolled my eyes. "Give him a break," I said. "He obviously doesn't know what he's doing." As I said this, the elderly man continued to shuffle around the room, sprinkling water on the statues of Buddha and the other artifacts laid out on the tables, all the while muttering, "Wo sho sigaran, wo sho sigaran." "I'm fine with just going, but you should at least ask him if he has any water. My bottle's completely empty," Sarah said. It was a good idea to get a refill before we left. Yangshuo is ridiculously humid and hot all year round, so even though it was already late October, it felt like mid-July in Florida. We were so sweaty that we could easily get dehydrated just by standing around, even without riding the bikes. "Yeah, that's a good idea," I responded. I was about to turn to the man for one last attempt at communication, to hopefully find out where we could get some water. He violently shook the maraca-like tool, drizzling water on my shorts and the floor around my feet. Some even splashed up on the pant leg of my shorts. "Wo sho sigaran," he muttered again. But this time, it caused a chill to run through me. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was wrong. "Wo sho sigaran." I took a step towards the man and felt my foot slide slightly as it touched the floor. I looked down and saw the unnatural layer of gray dust that had collected on the floor. How could there be so much dust on the floor if someone lived here? "Wo sho sigaran." I was getting increasingly uncomfortable and felt the urge to leave, but I couldn't understand why. I glanced over to Sarah, about to speak, when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Maybe I missed it due to all the clutter, but this room was in noticeably worse condition than the others. The walls had black stains on them. The wood in the window frame was blackened and seemingly shattered, far more brittle than those of other apartments. It almost seemed like this specific apartment had survived a series of accidents, but was still somehow standing. So was this the only room left occupied? "Wo sho sigaran." The broken old man shuffled past once again, and this time I got a quick spray in the face. The powerful odor assaulted my nostrils. The smell of the scented water was off. It was too potent, too abrasive. It almost had a toxic fragrance to it. It made me want to cough to get it out of my nose and throat. Whoa, sho sigaran. An icy shiver ran through me as I made a sudden realization. Guys, we need to go, now. I didn't wait for Sarah or David to respond. I made for the door and ran until I reached my bike. Hey, what's going on? David called out as I was midway through the courtyard. Why'd you ditch us? Sarah asked. They'd both caught up to me and were mounting their bikes, slightly out of breath. I didn't answer them. We rode the trail we entered through in silence. After only about half an hour of riding, we stumbled upon some hikers, both Swedish. They spoke impeccable English, which was good because I wasn't in the mood for talking, and Sarah was eager to take over so we could find our way back to the hostel. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were back at the hostel, that Sarah insisted that I tell them what had me so freaked out. What's going on? Ever since we were at that creepy old guy's house, you've been acting really weird. I didn't want to tell them, because I was hoping that if I kept it to myself, then maybe the realization I made would somehow be less real. Maybe if I didn't say it out loud, then I could believe that it hadn't really happened. But it had. Remaining silent about it wouldn't change that. I sighed. You know what that guy kept repeating? Yeah, you told us it means I'm short for people. That can't be what's bothering you, though. That's not what he was saying. I heard it wrong, I replied. You see, the thing about Chinese is that tones make all the difference. For example, if you hear "guh, guh," it could either mean older brother or each and every, depending on what tones are used. What I thought was, I'm missing 4 people. Wasn't that at all. It wasn't until I understood what he had actually sprayed me with that I realized I'd been hearing the tones wrong. He wasn't sprinkling water all over his apartment. He was sprinkling kerosene. And he wasn't saying, I'm missing 4 people. What he was really saying was, I burned everyone. A Thursday 2 months ago, I stepped into the kitchen and noticed a small puddle of grayish water on the floor. A huge, moist spot of grayness covered the ceiling. I called my landlord straight away. I told her that there was a leak and that either a pipe must have burst or some water might have accumulated on the flat roof. She said she would send someone straight away. I asked whether she needed the key. She said no. I suppose that I'm an idiot. I assumed that the lack of phone calls during the day was a good sign, and that when I got home, it would all be fixed. I felt some nervousness on the ride home. The bus was slow, and my thoughts went a bit overboard. I scolded myself for being ridiculous. Far from ridiculous. From the outside, the bungalow looked fine. I pressed the key in the keyhole, turned it, and pushed the door open. Immediately, a moldy old water stench welcomed me. If you've ever had the pleasure of cleaning an old aquarium thick with algae, you know what I'm talking about. The water and debris was already in the corridor. The kitchen looked like an earthquake had struck. Pieces of wood, cement, insulation material, and chipped off paint were all over the floor. The sticky gray water covered not just the center of the room, where the ceiling had crashed, but seemed to have splattered on every single wall and piece of furniture. The old water stench by now had become a pungent smell of rot. Some of the water seemed to have flown in small trickles into every room, and there were small puddles or dried gray stains everywhere. At first, the landlord apologized profusely. Then, when the handyman came and told her that there was no pipe to fix, she blamed me instead. She said that I must have done something to the ceiling. One of the men suggested that it might have been rainwater that had trickled through small holes in the roof and collected over weeks, months, or maybe even years in the insulation material of the ceiling. I understand why my landlord was so suspicious that I'd done something. Basically, since the first week of moving in, I had complained about the paint that occasionally chipped off the walls and ceiling. Paint of so many layers that had been painted on top of one another. The bungalow badly needed a renovation, and she knew it, but she didn't want to spend any money on it. The, for its condition, far overpriced bungalow was her cash cow that she wanted to milk until the cow died, or rather, until the falling ceiling killed someone. I only stayed because it was so close to work. For 3 weeks, I had to get up half an hour earlier to make sure that I got in my shower before the builders came. In the evenings, I came home every night for a new smell. Plastic, plaster, powdered insulation material. It was hard to imagine what exactly the 4 guys did during the day. But they didn't just leave smells. They also left trash. Obvious trash that I ended up throwing out because they never bothered to do it themselves. I had to live in the mess, eat my cereal between heaps of trash until I threw it out myself. In a way, it was curious to stare at the different materials that made up my home. It was kind of fascinating to guess what each of them were used for. The black, sticky rolls were likely for the roof. The yellow, fluffy ones, clearly insulation. The wooden planks and drywall plates likely were to be part of my future ceiling. The trash was harder to identify. Of course, there was also the yellow drywall, soaked in some sort of grayish water and covered in a moldy slime. I asked the builders 3 times to get rid of it, and in the end did it myself because just the sight of it made me feel sick, not to mention the smell. I pulled the slimy yellow marshmallow-like material into large black bags and put them outside. It was at the bottom of the heap where I found the white bag. I call it a bag because I don't know what better to refer to it as, and it was my first impression that it must be a bag. But the texture was different. It was flexible and strong like a bag, but it also seemed to have some structure. A scale pattern was pressed into the material. I hated the builders. I hated that they used my bedroom for their smoke breaks. I hated that they ate my food, and particularly my bread, during the day. I hated that they left pee on the toilet seat and soiled, dirty water all over the apartment. I was happy when they finally finished. The ceiling looked like a patchwork because the landlord felt I was the one who should do the paint job. The kitchen and corridor were a mess, and a few persistent spots of sticky mass were on the kitchen counter and outside the front door. But all in all, I was happy to be on my own again. For 2 days, I lived in the mess. Then the weekend came, and I finally had time to clean up. I spent 4 or 5 hours on cleaning the apartment. I got neither rid of the old smoke, nor of the all-permeating smell of moldy old water. Still, after those 4 hours, I sat in my armchair, and for the first time in weeks, maybe even months, felt relaxed. Truly relaxed. To the core. I fell asleep like that. I woke up at 3 a.m. because the light was still on. I made my way to the bedroom and nearly had a fit of rage. There was water on the floor. Grayish, slightly thick water. The ceiling looked perfectly fine. No holes, no dripping, no wet spots. I wiped it off and checked the walls as well as the floor for any possible leaks. Nothing. By 4:30 a.m., I was finally in my bed. Every night, a few more puddles of grayish water appeared. I told the landlord about it, and she had a go at me that I should be more responsible. At that point, I made the mental decision to move out. But only now that's really a conscious decision. Only now that's really a fact. It took me a whole month to overcome my denial. The puddles were always in the same places. At the foot of my bed, right next to my door, at the entrance of the bathroom, and at several places in the kitchen. Mostly the fridge. There weren't any leaks, and the air wasn't moist enough to create whole puddles of liquid, and even less to create puddles of grayish liquid. After a week, I had found the common pattern. First, I looked for repeat spots in order to figure out where the leaks or stored liquid in the ceiling were. There were the 3 spots I mentioned already, but still occasionally there were wet spots in the middle of the corridor or near the back door. In the second week, when I knew the repeat spots, I watched the ceiling and surrounding areas closely. Still, there was no sign of any liquid seeping through the cracks in the ceiling, and certainly not enough to form a puddle. During the third week, I gave up on the puddles. I made sure all windows were locked, and I made sure that I had checked all the suspicious areas for signs of moisture. But honestly, work was exhausting, and I just didn't want to think about any of it. I didn't even bother wiping the puddles up unless they got too big. I felt hopeless. The smell had soaked through my clothes, and even at work the smell seemed to come out of my skin as if I myself were filled with dirty grayish water. At the end of the third week, the puddles suddenly stopped. There was nothing more. I wondered probably more why they disappeared than I wondered why they'd been there to begin with. Still, all I felt was relief and happiness, a deep sense of liberation. I slept well again. 6 days in a row, the puddles were gone. That brings us to today. That brings us to the reason why I'm in a hotel I can't afford. When I woke up this morning, I smelled it right away. It was more pungent than ever before, and in between the smell of stale, rotting water was something else. Something fresher. A note like sweat. On my way out of the bedroom, I stared at the huge puddle in disgust. It led straight from the door to my bed and continued behind the door into the kitchen. There was also a branch of thinner spots towards the bathroom. I wiped it up straight away. I knew I would be late for work, but I just didn't want to come home only to expect to see more suffocating liquid soaked into the cheap floorboards. I started in the bathroom because it felt like the easiest. Then I made my way to the kitchen and wiped the liquid up. I had to change the cleaning water 2 times to get rid of all the gray marks on the floor. Finally, I got back to my bedroom. It was definitely the worst of the rooms, and I wondered why I hadn't woken up from the noise that the flood of liquid surely must have produced. I had just changed the cleaning water for the 3rd time when I realized that the puddle continued under the bed. I pulled the blanket up and pushed my bed towards the far corner. The bed moved. The puddle seemed to have spread even larger under the bed. Suddenly, something white appeared. Something white and thin, like a plastic bag. The wrinkled and ripped textile was soaked full of grayish water. In size and shape, it was only a bit smaller than me. I pushed it around with the mop. A corner folded over, and I saw a piece of bread. A piece of fresh bread, right next to the top of the white bag. It took me nearly a minute to recognize where I'd seen it before. I recognized it because of the scale pattern. Then it took me only a second to realize what it was. Not a bag. A shed skin. You may not remember hearing about it on the news, but in July of 2008, there were a string of missing person cases out of the University District in Seattle. 12 people went missing, all of them students at the University of Washington. Their bodies were never found, and no significant evidence was ever recovered. They were all presumed dead, much to the distress of the people who cared about them. Aside from the missing people, though, not much of the case was ever revealed to the public. That's what I'm here to remedy. People have a right to know these things.
As of now, the case has gone cold, and all the documents relating to it now sit in a classified file cabinet that SPD employees jovially refer to as the freezer. Investigators had followed several leads, but all of them had arrived at dead ends. They'd quixotically sworn to bring the criminal, or criminals, to justice, but when all of their attempts at moving the case forward had failed, they backed off like frightened kittens, kicked in the gut. The most promising lead, though, had been one that showed itself relatively early in the case's lifespan, around September of the first year. It turned out that all of the abducted students had owned the same Apple computers. This, in and of itself, could have been mere coincidence, but further examination by the forensic team showed that every single student had been using proxy servers before the time of their disappearance. For those who don't know, a proxy server is an intermediary web server often used to keep internet activity as anonymous as possible, disguising IP addresses, which, again, for those who don't know, are essentially unique series of numbers given to each computer connected to the internet. With basic knowledge and just a bit of hacking skill, it's possible to find someone's exact location by using their IP address alone. Proxy servers operate with separate IP addresses, usually with locations far away from their users. So, the students were using altered IP addresses. But why? Were they hiding from someone? Proxy servers are, after all, the best way to hide yourself over the internet. As the forensic team continued to garner information from the abducted students' hard drives, more and more similarities were found. Some of them certainly could have been coincidences, but others, there was frankly no way. This is a segment of a report typed up by the computer forensics team, detailing the similarities between the 12 laptops. All computers installed with the web browser Google Chrome. All computers using iTunes, each with approximately 50 gigabytes of music. All computers using proxy servers. All proxy servers appear to have IP addresses based in Iceland. They were all using proxies based in Iceland, which was odd, but the report didn't end there. It continued. All computers have Microsoft Word installed, though there appear to be no documents saved in the Documents folder of any of the computers. That's normal enough. Lots of people save their documents in folders on their desktops or on other drives. Desktops on all computers are devoid of files and icons, except for a black document that appears in the center of all of them, titled Líta, a Bach. The document has no text. That's where it begins to get very strange. Líta, a Bach is Icelandic, meaning something like look back or look behind you. It appears that the file on the desktop is the only saved document anywhere on all 12 computers. Once is a coincidence. Twice is also a coincidence. But 12 times? The exact same empty document saved in the same place with the same title? It's impossible, but clearly not so impossible that it's, well, impossible. The report continued for a bit after that, but with nothing nearly as significant. When the keyboards were dusted for fingerprints, none of them matched up. There was nothing linking them other than the documents. The forensic specialists were spooked by the findings, but none of them reported any suspicious or paranormal activity afterwards. The Iceland-based proxy servers and documents with titles in Icelandic led investigators to seek other connections between Iceland and the missing students. They went to their parents, probably hoping to find that the students all had relatives in Iceland or something. They needed to solve the case. But of course, none of them had any apparent ties to the country. No friends, no relatives. Nothing. The investigators had questioned dozens upon dozens of people, but had found nothing of worth. It was beginning to seem hopeless. That was, until a year later, in July of 2009, when the Icelandic National Police in Reykjavik reported a string of missing persons, gone without a trace. This was it. This was what the SPD needed. They eagerly contacted the office in Reykjavik and arranged a meeting, hoping that the cases would somehow match up. Seattle investigators flew overseas, and the information they found was, simply put, terrifying. 12 people in Reykjavik had gone missing, all of them students at the University of Iceland. They all had Apple computers. They all used proxy servers. The proxy's IPs were based in Seattle. They all had Microsoft Word installed, but only one empty document saved on their empty desktops. Can you guess what it was titled? Líta, a buck. When both investigation teams shared their information, things finally looked bright for both cases. This was obviously the work of the same criminal mastermind. It had to have been. They were going to catch whoever, or whatever, did this. It was all in the name of justice, even when there weren't any bodies to be found. And for all they knew, the missing students could all have been alive, well, and peaceful. The rush of optimism ended after only a few days, when the forensic team in Iceland dusted the computer keyboards, only to find that none of the prints matched. The SPD agents, although disappointed, weren't surprised. Once again, it was hopeless, like so much else. There was still no suspect. There was still no evidence with which to convict. There was just a bunch of very, very creepy coincidences. 24 of them, to be exact. Nothing more, and certainly nothing less. The leads led nowhere. The search for what happened to the students became a joint investigation between the overseas offices, but there were never any more significant leads. The cases, or just singular case now, had gone stagnant. And after months and months and months of dwindling tenacity, both the SPD and National Police Force in Iceland finally put the case on the shelf in July of 2012. Cold, frozen, barren, tundra. It was over. So much for justice. Since then, both police departments have tried to forget about the case. It's become a hollow memory, one no one likes to think about, understandably. And that's all there is to this case, really. I'm writing this now because I'm pretty bored, and I figured it was interesting enough to let you know about. I need to go take a shower now. However, before I go, I'd just like to make you realize how difficult it was to brainwash the students by getting them to read my stories. Humans are very perceptive when it comes to things like that. Their meat was worth it, though. Very tender and delicious. But I'm still a bit hungry. Líta, a buck.
They say that when you take a picture of someone, you capture their soul in the camera. They also say that if you print it off, that picture will contain the soul itself, and that you can control them with it. I'm not sure where to start. Do you know what the primordial soup is? A veritable ocean of elements all floating around randomly, and through millions of years of time, eventually the right set of random circumstances came to pass and the elements were able to connect together and form the world's first single-cell organism. Now, that's a really boiled down version of it, but I'm sure you get the gist of it. Fast forward a few billion years to the early 1990s, when internet use began to rapidly accelerate. Every home had a computer, and new connections between computers were opening on a by-the-second basis. Trillions of bytes of data began to transfer around the world at the speed of light. Music, text, sound, and, most importantly, pictures. Now, if when you take a picture of someone, you capture their soul, what happens when that picture is converted to data and placed on a hard drive? Does the soul follow? Well, 15 years later, we believe so. We believe that when you take a picture of somebody and upload it onto your computer, that alongside the image data, a blueprint of the person's soul itself is imprinted on the file. Look at your pictures folder. How many souls reside in that folder alone? That's just the beginning, though. These soul blueprints each retain pieces of a puzzle, parts of the soul itself as well. Recently, a group of hackers who refer to themselves as the Cardinals took an interest in this theory and began some experiments. They found anomalies within the binary sequences of images based on similar features of the person they had taken a picture of. A binary DNA, if you will. Now, these hackers had come to possess a set of 3 extremely important data files. 1 AVI, 1 JPEG, and 1 MP3, each of which possessed interesting, unexplainable qualities. The first, cradle.avi, depicts what appears to be a group of teenagers with a low-quality video camera exploring the basement of a house. The quality of the video is distorted completely beyond any comprehensibility, and the video is very low quality.
For most of the video, the camera is passed around the group, handed back and forth, and jerked around too much to make anything noticeable out. But near the end, the camera turns at an odd angle, and you can semi-clearly make out a young girl standing in the corner facing the wall. Her hair is long and black, and she's wearing some form of white dress. You only see her for a split second, but many people who have seen the video claim there just seems something wrong with her. Like she's a bit deformed, but not in a way that anyone can explain. But the truly peculiar property of this video is what happens to the user's computer at the end of it. On the last second of the video, if not already so, the video will force full screen itself. Along with this, you're left with a 1-second looping clip of a window in a wall. It repeats 15 times, and then the girl is seen again, standing on the other side of the window with her back to the viewer, slowly wavering back and forth. After a few moments, the video ends and the user's computer permanently shuts down. Inspection has shown that the entire registry becomes completely corrupt, requiring the user to do a total wipe and reinstall. The second file is known as needles.mp3. This sound file, when played, plays for about 3 minutes. It's extremely distorted. One can occasionally make out some form of voice talking, but most of the sound is some form of growling, like a rolling, crackled roar. Users who listen to this file often experience extreme nausea and loss of balance for a brief period of time. The final file is known as burningman.jpg. The file name has nothing to do with what the actual picture depicts. Instead, it just displays a haphazard mess of overlaid meshed images of dolls in a hallway. There also seems to be an image of a man standing with his head cast down in the background, but the image is too distorted to make anything out, much like the other files. The image, when downloaded and opened on a user's desktop, will proceed to stay permanently open on whatever program it's opened through. Not only that, but the program becomes disabled. Nothing else happens. The image just permanently sits there on your desktop, unclickable, unminimizable, and you're just left there with this man's invisible gaze staring at you. From what the group of hackers were able to discern, this file seems to have pre-compiled into the data something along the lines of CMDOW. Yet, as complex and intricate as the program is, it works across all OS platforms, no one knows who the original creator is. In fact, few people have heard of it, as the file is uncopyable and unsendable. This, in fact, further adds to the mystery, as often receivers of this file will obtain it from random anonymous emails posted on forums with a download link. This poses the question, how was that poster able to upload it? If you ever see any of these files, refrain from downloading any of them. They all have varying detrimental effects on your computers, from practically taking out your whole registry, corrupting System 32, freezing your mouse, or crashing your computer. This is where the story takes a turn for the bizarre. This group of hackers, the Cardinals, took to analyzing these 3 files and comparing their odd behaviors. They'd heard of other such files, images, data, etc., but were never able to get their hands on them. At least, as far as we know, though rumor states they were in fact able to locate and collect all the known files, like the original smile.jpg, barbie.avi, even suicidemouse.avi. not even the grifter was able to escape their grasp, rumor states. But rumor also states that the grifter video even exists, but that's another story. Nonetheless, all these files in hand, the group lined the files up and began to meticulously work through the binary, 10/1 at a time, checking for similar strains and series of binary that matched. And they did manage to successfully do so, at least legend states. The result was 7 individual execute files that did nothing, simply a gibberish pile of zeros and ones. They endlessly puzzled over the files, each tackling an execute. They decided to name them after themselves: lust, gluttony, greed, envy, sloth, wrath, and pride. At last, they attempted to line the files up. Remarkably, something odd happened. The copies of the files quite suddenly meshed together. The result was a single complete execute, already named barelybreathing.exe. And what of this file? Well, not much else is known after that point. I mean, they were far too smart to just execute it. They analyzed the file every possible way: hex, binary, conversions, anything to figure out what this odd thing would do. To no avail. Even after forming together, it was an even bigger jumble of ones and zeros that made no more sense than the separate executes did. They backed the file up on a flash drive and proceeded to run it. That was the last command found on their destroyed computers a week later. Their corpses had been disfigured beyond recognition. A description of the corpses stated that it almost seemed as if they had been brutally slashed across their faces and arms. Every square inch of skin that had been bare had been mutilated, almost microwaved and then sliced repeatedly by what looked like a micro-thin razor. Naturally, the government attempted to hush up the event, but there was some media leakage, and because the Cardinals had been keeping a blog amongst themselves and a few close friends, it's deleted, so don't go trying to find it. It quickly spread out as per what they had been attempting to accomplish. And if it was or was not related to their terrible deaths. And what of the flash drive? A friend who knew of its existence later checked the home of the group and was unable to find it. According to reports, the drive was found in the pocket of one of the group and had been taken into custody by the police, and then simply vanished. The trail continues on, far more though. The file resurfaces every few weeks around the globe. Governments attempt to cover it up, but some media always leaks out, of course. Look to the news for people mutilated in their own homes by a murderer, their computers stolen, etc. If you ever get a cryptic email with an attachment labeled barelybreathing.exe, for Christ's sakes, don't open it.
It may be hard to believe for those of us born in the digital age, when every embarrassing moment can potentially be uploaded to YouTube for posterity, but an estimated 70% of all films from the silent era are thought to be lost. Of the silent directors whose works have largely vanished, perhaps the most intriguing, at least for me, is the German director Kai Winkelmann, born 1887, died 1926. Although influential in his own era, he has since been largely forgotten, for reasons which I will believe become readily apparent if you listen further. Winkleman was born on September 18th, 1887 in Offenbach am Main, the son of a butcher. He reportedly found the family business very distasteful and didn't get along well with his father, who drank heavily. After serving on the Russian front in World War I, a period of Winkleman's life which left him permanently traumatized, Winkleman married a certain Greta Schultz, a nurse whom he had met at a veterans hospital. He moved with her to her home city of Vienna, Austria, where he began making films for the pioneering producer Joe May. Winkleman created many moderately successful films while working under May, several of which survive in whole or in part. But by far his most successful work was the Lord Lister serial. The Lister series, based on a series of pulp stories concerning a gentleman thief named Lord Lister, who goes by the nom de guerre Raffles in the criminal underworld, consists of 6 episodes, each about an hour in length. The films bear a somewhat superficial resemblance to their source material. In the original novels, as in the first 2 episodes of the Lister serial, Lord Lister is a somewhat sympathetic Robin Hood-like figure, a la Arsène Lupin, who rarely commits any particularly egregious misdeeds. In Winkleman's Lister serials, however, he became a much more sinister figure, a seemingly omnipotent mastermind of crime who isn't above rape and mass murder. In the serial, as in the novels, Lord Lister is pursued by a Scotland Yard detective named Baxter. In the early installments of the serial, Baxter is portrayed as a figure of fun, an incompetent drunkard who is always outwitted by the master thief. But in the later episodes, Baxter becomes something of a tragic figure, an honest lawman who is helpless to prevent the atrocities of his implacable persecutor, Lord Lister. Although Lord Lister was played by several different actors, the idea being that his true face was unknown, Detective Baxter was always played by Winkleman's friend and confidant, actor Olaf Schneider. Olaf Schneider became close friends with Winkleman shortly after the latter began working with Joe May. The two could not be any more different in appearance or in temperament. Schneider was healthy, muscular, and a lover of fast cars and boxing, while Winkleman was a recluse and often in poor health. Nevertheless, the two shared a close relationship, perhaps finding common ground over the tragedies in their respective pasts. Winkleman had had an abusive childhood and was left mentally scarred by his service in World War I, while Schneider's wife had committed suicide in 1918, leaving him to raise their infant daughter alone. The contents of the first 5 Lister films, insofar as they can be safely reconstructed at all, only one of them survives, and even then, only in an incomplete print, are as follows. Number 1. Lister tritt ein. Enter Lister. The screenplay of this first episode was written by none other than legendary director-screenwriter Fritz Lang. In this installment, Lister, who is living under the assumed name Lord William Aberdeen, manages to steal a valuable painting during an art exhibition. The bumbling detective Baxter eventually manages to arrest Lister, but the latter escapes, switching identities with a guard in a clever ruse. A spectacular chase scene ensues, during which Lister, of course, escapes. Number 2. Lister schlagt zurück. Lister hits back. The film opens with an elaborate scene where Lister steals the pearl necklace off a duchess's neck at the opera house. Shortly thereafter, Lister boldly announces his next crime via a newspaper advertisement. He will steal the family jewels of Lord Wilmore at such and such an hour. Baxter and his fellow policemen stand guard at Lord Wilmore's side in his mansion, waiting for Lister to appear. But he never does. Just when he is about to dismiss the incident as a hoax, Baxter hears muffled cries and discovers the real Lord Wilmore bound and gagged in a wardrobe. Lister had been impersonating him the entire night, and the real jewels had already been replaced with identical duplicates. Baxter then realizes that the mansion is rigged to explode and barely escapes with his life. This is the only surviving Lister film. Number 3. Lister in America. Detective Baxter receives a tip that Lister is hiding in the United States. Baxter boards an ocean liner, but halfway across the Atlantic, the voyage begins to go horribly awry. The passengers are falling mysteriously ill. It seems that Lister has planted plague-infested rats on board, presumably in an attempt to assassinate Baxter. Upon his arrival in New York, Baxter is swiftly arrested for a series of murders that Lister committed, and a local judge, really Lister in disguise, sentences him to death by hanging. Baxter makes a desperate escape through the sewer system and emerges into the night air, where he is greeted with the sight of Lister taunting him from a rooftop. He is wearing his iconic costume, a black cloak, black gloves, and a black executioner's mask. Lister mockingly crosses and extends his wrists, as if daring Baxter to arrest him. Number 4. Das Todliche Parfüm. The Deadly Perfume. Detective Baxter investigates a series of grisly murders. Someone has been replacing department store perfume with sulfuric acid, resulting in dozens of deaths and disfigurements. In order to uncover the truth, Baxter forms an alliance with a young woman who claims to have been Lord Lister's lover. Despite being a married man, Baxter soon begins to succumb to her charms as well. The film ends with a shocking scene. Due to the machinations of Lister, Baxter is forced to allow the young woman to be run over by a train in order to avert an accident that would kill hundreds of people. Number 5. Die Schreien like the Screaming Corpse. Little is known about the contents of this particular film, as contemporary reviews contain little but exclamations of disapproval. It is known to chronicle Baxter's descent into alcoholism and depression after his repeated failures to capture Lister. The plot reportedly involved a deadly fire at an opera house and a surreal scene wherein Lister wears a man's flesh as a mask. Despite, or perhaps because of, their often morbid content, the films were quite popular with the contemporary viewing public. One might consider them the Saw of their day. As you might have guessed, the increasing darkness of Winkleman's films was accompanied by a corresponding crisis in his personal life. The affair between Winkleman's wife Greta and his closest friend, Olaf Schneider. Winkleman seems to have known of the affair and tacitly accepted it, although eventually this seems to have taken a considerable toll on his already fragile psyche. In a letter to his cousin, dated October 13th, 1923, Winkleman writes, "And why shouldn't she prefer him? A man like him can offer her what I, with my frail body and lacerated soul, could never hope to give her. My dark muse has seized control of my life. I am powerless to do anything but obey its commands." This state of affairs continued for some time before an unthinkable tragedy put an end to both the Lord Lister serial and Winkleman's partnership with Schneider, at least for the time being. In December of 1923, Winkleman was away on business in Frankfurt, having left his 18-month-old son alone with his wife. The live-in housekeeper was away visiting her sister. According to a report that a distraught Greta later gave the police, she and Schneider were making love in the bedroom when suddenly she heard a loud thud from the child's room. Her son had evidently climbed out of his crib, breaking his neck. Naturally, this created a gigantic scandal, and no one was particularly surprised when Greta disappeared one day, presumably to start a new life under an assumed name. As for Schneider, he emigrated soon thereafter to the United States, where he dropped out of public eye. Despite the horrendous personal tragedies that had befallen him, Winkleman held up as well as could be imagined under the circumstances. Although he had been a doting father, at least when he was not distracted by his filmmaking career, he managed to bear his grief with a certain quiet dignity, even founding his own film company a few months later. Winkleman's studio was relatively successful at first, turning out several lucrative, if unremarkable, films. A few years after his son's death, however, strange rumors began circulating around Winkleman. It was said that he had fired most of his staff and spent his days wandering around his empty, decrepit Filmstadt. In an interview with the Rache Zeitung, dating to 6 months before his death, Winkleman claimed that he had fully forgiven Schneider and, rather surprisingly, had been corresponding with him and planned for them to make a film together. To the surprise, and later dismay, of the viewing public, a final installment of the Lord Lister saga, entitled Lister's Rache, Lister's Revenge, was released in 1927. Lister's Rache was screened in only a few theaters before being permanently withdrawn from circulation. The film, only 40 minutes long, was much more surreal and expressionistic than any previous installment in the series, and much more unsettling. Contemporary accounts, though doubtless exaggerated, mention fainting fits and worse at advanced screenings of the film. According to contemporary newspaper reports, the film begins with an intertitle explaining that Detective Baxter has lost his job with Scotland Yard and been abandoned by his family. Baxter is shown in a dirty, disordered apartment room, sitting at a writing desk. There is no other furniture around him. Baxter is writing a note whose contents we do not see, and weeping all the while. He is surrounded by empty beer bottles, and his appearance is unkempt and disheveled. The crying scene continues for an uncomfortably long time, after which Baxter leaves his apartment and wanders through the streets of London. The city is represented by a series of surreal matte paintings, reportedly very much in the style of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, full of absurd angles that would be impossible in reality. Sinister shapes can be discerned in the background. Hanged bodies, weeping, disfigured faces, etc. Detective Baxter finally pauses in the middle of a tall bridge, contemplating the rough waters and jagged rocks below. It is clear that he is considering suicide. Suddenly, a dark shape materializes at the other end of the bridge. It is Lister, wearing his usual executioner's hood and cloak. Lister shouts, "Jump!" via an intertitle, of course. And Baxter, after a moment's pause, manages to gather his resolve and chase after his nemesis. After a brief chase scene, Lister leaps into an enormous sinkhole, with Baxter following close behind. In the next scene, the detective finds himself in an enormous cavern, presumably the master criminal's base of operations. It becomes clear that the cavern is filled with furniture: a dining table with chairs, a wardrobe, a wash basin, even a bookcase. Baxter cautiously approaches the table, soon realizing, to his horror, that all of the furniture appears to be made of human bone. In the center of the cavern is an enormous pile of human body parts, casually stacked together like a compost heap. Baxter recoils in horror and attempts to run back to the entrance of the cavern. But it is too late. Lister, with two other masked men on either side of him, is swiftly approaching, carrying an axe. We see their shadows on the wall of the cave encroach on the detectives, finally engulfing it completely. The scene shifts yet again. Detective Baxter is shown inside a damp dungeon of sorts, his hands and feet manacled to the wall. He is bruised and bloodied. A large metal door swings open and Lister reappears, still accompanied by his two masked henchmen. One of the henchmen is carrying a struggling, wriggling form. A blindfolded little girl, around 10 years of age. Lister tells Baxter, "Now you and your daughter will be reunited, just as you wished." With that, the two masked thugs hold the screaming and kicking little girl down on the ground, while Lister withdraws a butcher knife from somewhere within his cloak and calmly, methodically slashes her throat. The two masked henchmen then place the dying little girl opposite the distraught Detective Baxter. Blood is oozing from her mouth and throat, but she is still breathing slightly. Lister declares, "Leave him to his fate," and the three masked men exit the room, leaving Baxter to watch helplessly as his daughter breathes her last. An intertitle announces that 3 weeks have passed, and Baxter is still chained where Lord Lister left him. His clothes are ragged, his skin is covered in bruises and blisters, and his eyes have a wild, haunted look. Across from him is the corpse of his daughter, bloated and blackened. The iron door slowly creeps open, and Lord Lister reappears, once again shadowed by his two masked accomplices. This time, he is carrying what appears to be a burlap sack. The two henchmen unchain Baxter. He attempts to strangle Lister, but in his pathetically weakened state, he is easily restrained. Lord Lister slowly pulls an object from the sack. It is a long-haired human head, still dripping blood. "Kiss your wife," Lister exclaims. A horrified Baxter refuses, but the henchmen punch him into submission and restrain his arms. Lister forces the severed head's lips against Baxter's, the latter retching all the while. Baxter is then returned to his restraints, and the two accomplices proceed to savagely beat him with nail-studded wooden planks, while Lister looks on. Lord Lister motions for his men to stop the beating, and Baxter looks up with dying eyes at his tormentor, lying in a pool of his own blood. "Do you realize now why you've never managed to catch me? Why you could never have won?" Lord Lister begins to peel off his hood and turns around to face the camera directly. We see his true face for the first time. Or rather, the space where one should be. For Lister does not possess one at all. His face is a blank wall of flesh with nothing at all to mark it as human, except for a gaping black mouth. "I am Loss," he says, drifting closer and closer toward the camera, as if threatening to break through it. Lord Lister's jaw opens wider and wider, far wider than should be humanly possible. It reaches almost down to his waist, as if threatening to engulf the audience and all the world. With that image, the film abruptly ends. As mentioned above, Lister's Rache was a resounding failure with audiences at advanced screenings, and it was quickly pulled from most theaters. Evidently, the film was too much, even for a movie-going public that had made Winkleman a wealthy man for his earlier forays into aestheticized violence. Audiences had found the film's gore effects to be disturbingly convincing. So convincing, in fact, that many suspected that they were not effects at all, and a warrant was soon issued for Winkleman's arrest. After the police had searched in vain for Winkleman at his home, a fire was reported at his downtown film studio. Several hours later, Winkleman's body, having been pulled from the smoldering ruins of his Filmstadt, was identified using his fingerprints. though his garments were badly burned, he appeared to have been dressed in black. The bodies of Olaf Schneider, his 10-year-old daughter, and his former lover, Greta Winkleman, were never recovered. Like most of Winkleman's films, Lister's Rache has vanished almost without a trace. Some copies were lost in fires, an unfortunately very common occurrence as early film stock was highly flammable, while others were deliberately destroyed. There is an interesting, though almost certainly apocryphal anecdote in Christian Eichheim's modern Schauermarsen aus der Stromfilmzeit about a rediscovered copy of Lister's Rache, which bears repeating here, if only for its dramatic interest. In 1974, so the story goes, Peter Flescher, an Austrian film collector, acquired a copy of Lister's Rache at an auction. After viewing the film on his private projector, he began to experience headaches, nausea, and, finally, hallucinations. He reported seeing a figure in a black cloak out of the corner of his eye, but the figure would vanish as soon as he turned his head. At first, this figure would appear to be far away, but it seemed to get closer over time. Eventually, Flescher began to suffer from insomnia. The figure would stand over his bed at night, but disappear as soon as the light switch was turned on. Every appearance of this figure would cause a feeling of intense despair and dread in Flescher. After several weeks of agony, Flescher finally burnt the film reel in his fireplace. The hallucinations ended, but an inexplicable smell of charred flesh lingered over the chimney. The same book also offers a rather strange urban legend concerning an alleged curse that hung over the life of Kai Winkleman. While serving on the Russian front during World War I, so the story goes, a dying prisoner of Romani descent who had been captured after a particularly bloody skirmish cast the evil eye on the young lieutenant. "The weight of the deaths you have caused will follow you like a cloud," the man is reported to have said. Perhaps this was the dark muse Winkleman spoke of in his letters. It bears mentioning here that Winkleman's sketchbook from his stay at the Veterans Hospital contains numerous line drawings of a faceless, cloaked figure. Regardless of what you think of the supernatural, ask yourself this: who is more real? Hamlet or Shakespeare? Dickens or Oliver Twist? Charles Foster Kane or Orson Welles? Some fictional characters have more life in them than you or I. Children are insane. This is an unspoken truth, a silent agreement among the older and wiser. Children see things that adults can't or won't, and we laugh it off and tell them everything's all right. There's nothing there. It's not real. And when they get a little older, they'll agree with us. Ghosties and ghoulies and things that go bump in the night exist no longer in the adult world. Children are insane, but they grow out of it. I'm not ashamed to admit that I still haven't grown out of one of my ridiculous childhood fears. Perhaps because I feel that it's still justified all these years later. I haven't outgrown it, merely pushed it to the back of my mind, where it still manifests in a dream now and then. You see, my parents died in a car accident when I was 3 years old. My only memories of them are static. Mom and Dad, reduced to the black and white photographs on my grandparents' hearth. It doesn't bother me to talk about it because I was far too young to mourn their passing. But I've always been curious to know what they were like, what kind of people they were. For reasons that I didn't understand at the time, my grandparents refused to talk about them except at length. It was painful for them in a way I'll never know. So after my parents died, my grandparents were not the natural choice, but the only one. My grandma didn't have Mom until she was 47 years old, and this was after suffering through 3 failed pregnancies. So they only had one child, my mother. And by the time of the accident, Grandma was 76 and Granddad 78. I had one uncle on my dad's side, but he was an alcoholic and wouldn't be able to take care of a 3-year-old kid. So off I went to my grandparents' house, despite the fact that both of them were way too old to be watching after a toddler. The older I got, the more I realized that Sunday mornings were my own personal hell. Granddad was religious and insisted that Grandma and I go to church with him every week, even though Grandma was about the least religious person I've ever known. She couldn't care less about God and heaven and Satan and hell, and influenced me in more ways than Granddad did, even though he tried his damnedest to get me to pay attention to him. Each morning at breakfast, he'd assault me with Bible verses, and each evening was dedicated to lecturing me on the possibility of eternal punishment in the lake of fire. It's also worth mentioning that he wasn't exactly a saint himself. He was a lawyer in his younger years and had helped plenty of terrible people escape jail time and state prison. Maybe he was trying to make up for it in his own way, but me and Grandma both suffered for it. The church that I saw each Sunday for the first few years of my life was a rickety old thing smack in the middle of nowhere. It was back on a hill, surrounded by a field of sunflowers during the summer, and a barren stretch of land during the other 3 seasons of the year. I'm sure it probably sounds charming to you, but the floor creaked like holy hell, and the walls would groan and shudder like the whole place was about to go up in a tornado. This would occur on a perfectly normal, breezeless day, and had all the children of the congregation convinced that the building was haunted. I think the worst part was the window. Yes, there was only one window in the entire building, and it was a crooked, amateurish stained glass rendition of Jesus Christ on the cross. The scene was bizarrely graphic, with the gaunt face of Christ turned to heaven, eyes rolled skyward, and the Roman soldiers' hammers poised mid-strike to drive nails into his hands. Bright red blood was shown squirting from the wounds. For the most part, no worse than anything you might see in any Christian church anywhere in the world, but the crude depiction and the cherry-colored blood made the window look exceptionally eerie, especially to a vulnerable, scrawny kid of 10 with an overactive imagination. When sun caught the window on any summer morning, Jesus and his bloody hands seemed to glow and pulse with unholy light. And that pale face lurked in my mind when I closed my eyes, and those rivulets of blood gleamed in my nightmares. I never wanted to be alone in that church. Not under the eyes of stained glass Jesus. Unfortunately for me, my fears were soon to be realized. One Sunday afternoon, after me and my grandparents had returned home from service, I realized that I'd left my dad's lucky rabbit foot on the pew back at church. The rabbit's foot was just a silly thing that my father had carried with him on his keychain back when he was alive. It was one of the few things recovered from the crash that was still intact, and when I was 6 years old, Grandma gave it to me. I saw the rabbit's foot as a way to connect with Dad, even though I'd never known him. So, naturally, I panicked. I wanted Grandma to go with me to get it, but she was worn out from the walk to church and back and told me I was old enough to go on my own. It wasn't much of a walk for a young boy like me, she said. But I kept seeing stained glass Jesus in his bright red blood, and that cold fear crept up in my mind as if I were really there, standing before him. I didn't want Granddad to go, so I finally relented. I took a long time walking alongside the road, hands jammed in my pockets, wanting to prolong my inevitable meeting with stained glass Jesus Christ as much as possible. Tall sunflowers swayed in the warm breeze like rippling ocean waves, and when I walked past them, they seemed to bend their heads and bow at my feet. Good luck, they seemed to say. Good luck, and goodbye. As eerie as the church was on any normal day, when it was empty, it was the stuff of nightmares. I opened the front door without stepping inside and stared into darkness. The entrance was a great yawning mouth, ragged velvet rug its tongue, and jagged wooden steps its teeth. I repressed my fear as best I could and took the stairs up into the church, careful to leave the front door open in case I needed to make a hasty exit. The sanctuary seemed to swallow all light, and to my 10-year-old self, the room was too large and simultaneously claustrophobic. I approached the pew where me and my grandparents had been sitting, the floorboards groaning with each step. And there was the rabbit's foot, just out of reach. I leaned in to grab it when I felt a presence in the room with me. You know the feeling when somebody is watching you, even if you're alone? It was like that, except I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. Stained glass Jesus would be watching me if I turned around. I didn't want to turn around, but the pews were pushed up next to the wall, and the only way to get out was to go back the way I came. So I turned back around and saw stained glass Jesus looking at me, even though I tried my hardest not to look at him. Here he was, all pale skin and white eyes and bloody hands, and we were completely alone. Both of my hands were gripped around the rabbit's foot like it were a life preserver in the middle of a raging storm. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. And then Jesus moaned. Light pulsed beyond the window, making him glow bright and unholy, and with each flicker the scene shifted. The Roman soldier's hammers swung back and forth, driving the nails deeper into his hands, blood spraying on impact. He moaned, and his eyes rolled in their sockets before focusing on me. That crude, gaunt face turned to me in the confines of colorful glass, and he opened his mouth and said, "Your parents burn in hell." Suddenly, I could move again. I was running out of the sanctuary, and out of the church, and into the blinding light of a summer afternoon before I was fully able to comprehend what had happened. As soon as my feet hit the dirt path outside of church, the doors slammed shut. It was over. I ran home without stopping. That evening, Grandma asked me if something was wrong. I never told her what I saw. As fate would have it, I never had to go back to the church with the stained glass Jesus. That night, my granddad died in his sleep. Nobody was exactly surprised. He was an old man, after all. After the funeral, me and Grandma packed up and moved closer to town. The rest of my childhood was relatively normal, and I'm grateful for it. My grandma died. Time passed, and I grew up. I've tried to rationalize the stained glass Jesus many times over the years. Perhaps it was a combination of a child's imagination coupled with both curiosity and fear over my parents. I've tried to tell myself that, but to this day, and I can't really accept it. I don't think I'll ever know. On summer evenings, when the sunlight catches just right between the trees, I'll think of that old church so many years ago. And when I think of the church, I know for a fact that when I close my eyes that night, I'll see stained glass Jesus and his gaunt face and skyward eyes and bloody hands. And I'll hear his voice, just like I'm 10 years old again. Your parents burn in hell.